The Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese and their diligence under American prejudice. Many Americans were excited about the Transcontinental Railroad's completion, but most of the public didn't know who actually built the railroad, the Chinese. The Transcontinental Railroad was a railroad that would connect the east and west coasts of America. Thousands of Chinese were given life-threatening tasks for $30 a month, or $751 today, and that was only for some workers. That was far below minimum wage, and then they had to pay for shelter and food, leaving them with little to survive on. Their deserved fame for building the Transcontinental Railroad was nowhere in sight. Nevertheless, they were undeniably the backbone of the Transcontinental Railroad. Without the Chinese, it wouldn't have been possible. While building the railroad, they had backbreaking work, long hours, and low pay. The officials of the project were responsible for the rights and fair treatment of the Chinese, yet they failed to do so. The Chinese began flooding into California with their mindset on one thing: gold. During the 1848 California gold rush, thousands of Chinese came in through boats with horrible conditions. Cabins would be infiltrated with rodents and often carry various diseases. However, many didn't find gold and they were stranded in California. Many settled for jobs and started a new life in America. But most couldn't find any jobs and they couldn't provide for themselves. Many of them, in China, were poverty-stricken and didn't have basic needs. Many left entire families behind, planning to strike gold and send money back to their families. Sadly, this didn't happen very often, leaving their families back in China with no sources of income. The first thought of a railroad that would connect America was in 1845 when a merchant named Asa Whitney proposed the idea to the government. He was rejected. He petitioned repeatedly for the construction of it, even publishing a booklet showing his imagined and ideal route for the railroad. Through his efforts, the public became very interested. The success of Eastern railroads, the gold rush, transportation of the military, and quicker postal service also increased interest. Many other people started to explore routes for the railroad, but there was no response from Congress, even in the late 1850s. But then, Theodore Judah, a young engineer obsessed with the Transcontinental Railroad idea, discovered a route through the Donner Pass in Northern California that would be ideal for train tracks. In 1860, he gathered four powerful businessmen: Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They would form the Central Pacific Railroad Company of California. So then, in 1861, Judah went to Washington, D.C. to propose his idea and successfully convinced Congress and Abraham Lincoln, the president at the time. Abraham Lincoln then signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law the following year. The act stated that the right of way through the public lands be, and the same is hereby granted to said company for construction of the railroad. The act also stated that the Central Pacific Railroad Company and the Union Pacific Railroad Company should build railways to meet and connect. Lastly, the act stated that for each mile of track laid, the companies would get $16,000 or $461,000 today to $48,000 or $1,383,000 today, and get 6,400 acres of government land for each 10 miles. The work started in 1863. However, the focus will be on the Central Pacific side, as that side's workforce is mostly Chinese. With a giant task on the Central Pacific's plate, they needed a lot of workers. Between 1863 and 1865, most workers were Irish immigrants. The Irish were confused by the work and were complaining. So many quit. Snowstorms through the Sierra Nevada and steep hills slowed down the construction even more. Now, the Central Pacific Railroad Company was scrambling for workers, so Charles Crocker, a manager for the project, suggested using the Chinese. But James Strobridge, one of the project managers, reluctantly agreed to hire 80 Chinese workers to add gunpowder to explosive cannons. As Strobridge saw the Chinese had an unbelievable work ethic, he kept on hiring them. Soon enough, about 12,000 Chinese workers were hired. During construction, the Chinese workers had to blast through the Sierra Nevada mountain range to allow for the building of the railroad. To do that, the Chinese had to go into tunnels, set off explosives inside the tunnel, and then run away. They were routinely lowered down cliffs in makeshift baskets with ropes where they drilled holes filled them with explosives, lit the fuse, and then were brought up as fast as possible. These explosions also caused avalanches. The Chinese also regularly faced physical abuse by their white supervisors. All of these factors killed hundreds of workers. Although this work was dangerous, they were given $26 a month and worked 6 days a week. Yet the white workers got $35 per month, had chefs in cabins, and didn't have threatening or dangerous jobs like the Chinese. It was their right to be equally treated and have safe working environments. The head of the project should have been accountable for their rights, as they had the responsibility to treat everyone equally, regardless of the worker's race. They should not have given the Chinese life-threatening tasks with lower pay than their white counterparts. On June 19, 1867, a tunnel explosion killed 5 Chinese workers. This was the last straw for the underpaid, overworked Chinese. So on June 24th, the Chinese stopped working and began the strike. The strike was highly organized and included 3,000 workers spanning over 30 miles of track. They demanded the same pay as their white counterparts and shorter hours. This threatened finishing the railroad, so Leland Stanford, one of the creators of the Central Pacific Railroad, decided to cut off their food supply. After 8 days, the strike ended. The Central Pacific decided to increase the wages for some experienced workers, raising their wage from $26 to $30. It was mostly considered a failure, yet it showed that the Central Pacific couldn't take the Chinese for granted and continue under these unfair wages and harsh working conditions. On May 10, 1869, the last spike was driven into the ground in Promontory, Utah. People celebrated all over the nation. It was because the Chinese participated in dangerous work that allowed for faster travel between coasts and economic growth. Yet, for their great work, their right to equal treatment and safe working environments was undermined. It was the project's officials that were responsible for giving those rights to the Chinese, but they failed to do so, and many died. Even though they built most of the Transcontinental Railroad, many did not know their crucial role. Thankfully, there have been articles and newspapers recognizing the hard work of the Chinese. A memorial was also built dedicated to the Chinese workers in Salt Lake City, Utah, giving them more recognition for their amazing contributions to this railroad, and allowing for this amazing feat in history to be constructed.